Thank you, Sarah, and good evening, everybody. Those of you who don't know me, I've been a leader for Naturetrek for about 20 years now. My profession was in the medical profession, actually. I was a GP for 30 years, but I've been a naturalist all my life. I apologize in advance, by the way, if I do cough and splutter through this, because I'm one of the many in the throes of recovering from COVID at the moment. But I think before I start, it's probably worth saying that there's going to be a degree of overlap here in my talk with what David's already presented to us. And that's really a measure of the similarities, if you like, in the wildlife across the three Baltic states in terms of the wildlife, and also the geography and the geology of the three. But nonetheless, I'm going to be talking about Latvia. And you'll see some similarities and hopefully some differences too. And certainly from my perspective, Latvia also is a great country to go and discover the wildlife of that part of Europe. So without further ado, here's a map to orientate you. Hopefully this mouse will work. You can see we'll fly from London on a flight direct to Latvia, to Riga, the capital of Latvia. And Riga is actually, interestingly, I think it's got one of the best airports I've ever been to. It really is a super airport. So here's Riga in the center, and this will be our first sort of area, one of our first areas to visit, the Kerami National Park. But really we'll start at Cape Kolka on the Gulf of Riga, just over here. And this island here, Saaremaa, I was actually on there last week. This is part of Estonia. So you can see there's a very good close proximity between Estonia and Latvia, with obviously Lithuania down at the bottom of the map. And as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of similarity and a lot of overlap. So we'll start our tour here at Cape Kolka. We'll have a couple of nights there exploring the area, and particularly the spit that points out into the Gulf of Riga. Then we'll move eastwards, calling it Kerami National Park, and then we'll be based for our second a few days at Lake Lubāns in the sort of east central Latvia. So this is, I'd say, just as our itinerary. We start off at Cape Kolka, go over to Kerami National Park, and then Lake Lubāns, and then return back to London. Now, this is the capital, Riga, and it's a very historic city, similar in many respects to Tallinn in terms of its interest from architectural points of view. And there will be opportunities either at the beginning of the tour or at the end of the tour to take an extension or a pre-tour stay in Riga to have your own sort of exploration, and the company, Naturetrek rather, will be able to set that up for you and help you out on that. So why do we go to Cape Kolka? Well, the main reason is of its juxtaposition jutting into the Gulf of Riga. These big arrows, at the time we're going to be there in May, represent the sort of flight paths of birds that are coming up from Southern Europe and Africa and further east, up through into Northern Europe and beyond for the breeding season. And also, obviously, there's a potential for birds to move from the east of Europe and concentrate in this area of Latvia. So this will be our first stop on the Cape Kolka, excuse me. And this is the sort of typical view we get here, and uninspiring fields, you may think, but nonetheless, they are really worthwhile exploring because they really do concentrate a lot of the spring migrants in these bushes and in these trees. Now, obviously, I'm sure you're aware that migration, the best time for migration is dependent on weather conditions. So we need the weather to be right for really good migration. On the other hand, it's good at any time, but if the conditions are absolutely right, these bushes can be more or less dripping with red starts and other migratory birds that have come up from the south on their way further north or to breed in the Baltic region. And the traditional sort of church that you would go past in Cape Kolka Just walking from our accommodation to the actual beach itself and the point where we will be able to look out, just showing you a view of inside the place that we stay near Cape Colca. Simple, but very, very comfortable, great food, very, very friendly people. And, you know, we really do have a good time staying here. All sort of mod coms as well, as you might imagine. So anyway, let's get to some of the reason we're going to be going there, which is the birds, really. So the migratory season in May in the Baltic regions, it can be absolutely superb. And some of the birds we will hope to see will include things like tree pipit, which migrate in great numbers into this part of the world in the spring. We'll even have birds like brambling. Bramblings, obviously, to us in the UK, they don't breed in the UK. There are one or two that do breed in Latvia, and we should certainly encounter them on many of our days as we're going around the country. There are lots of redback shrikes also. Some of them are migratory, just passing through, but nonetheless, there is still also a breeding population of these lovely birds, and we should certainly get ample opportunities, not just to see them, but those who are keen photographers will be more than pleased with the opportunities for photographing them. Other birds to find are more tricky, perhaps a little bit less showy than a redback shrike. So birds like pied flycatcher, for example, a bit more hidden in the bushes, but that's one of the joys of bird watching at a migratory hotspot. You never know what you might encounter. And we rely on each other in a group to be able to look for birds and point things out to each other as we go along. That's always a good philosophy. Birds like the rosefinch, as well, as David pointed out, not only are they beautiful to look at, but they also have a wonderful song in the springtime. And there's normally a good population of rosefinches knocking around the Colca area, as well as throughout the rest of the places we visit in Latvia. Some of the more obscure, if you like, birds we might encounter are things like Blythe's reed warbler. Now this is a fairly subdued colored bird, more often heard than seen, but they have such a very distinctive song that once you get your eye in, we should certainly be able to pick out a few of those, because these birds breed in Latvia, and we certainly encounter them on a reasonably regular basis. So it's a great opportunity to get a really good view of these birds, which are actually quite rare in Britain as passage birds. And then more familiar birds, perhaps like the bearded tit here, very distinctive. Lots of those around the coast of the Colca area with the big reed beds that are associated with that part of Latvia. And other reed bed specialties, things like the great reed warbler. This is a bird that's about as big as a song thrush. It's much bigger than a common reed warbler. I've got a very, very distinctive song. And there are many of these also spread around the many reed beds and a suitable habitat within the country, but not just on the coast, but also at Lake Lubans, where we end up in the second of our two-stay trip. And David mentioned the wildfowl, the waterfowl in this part of the world on the coast. And as far as Estonia is concerned, and Latvia is no less well supplied with them. And this is a long-tailed duck in flight. This actually, I took this photograph last week when I was in Estonia. And there were thousands upon thousands of these birds on the coast and the Gulf of the Baltic there. And this is typical of not just this time of the year, but also, hello, but also in the spring in Latvia. And if we're really lucky, we may encounter these birds too. This is Stella's Ida. This is a very much declining seabird nowadays, found in the Baltic, not only in Estonia, but also on the coast of Latvia. Everything depends on the particular circumstances, weather-wise, appertaining at the time of our visit. But this is certainly one to keep our eyes out for. And also, they're not just ducks on the Gulf, but there are also birds like black-throated diver, reasonably common. This is obviously a bird in summer plumage, so the ones we would encounter are probably not going to be as well adorned as that, but you never know. It depends on how far advanced their breeding cycle is. but also many, many thousands of common cranes. Cranes breed in good numbers in Latvia, but there are also substantial populations that pass through heading further north into Scandinavia. And we will certainly encounter these birds, dramatic at any time, but especially at dusk when you hear them gathering together to roost, and their bugling call. It's very, very evocative experience. And as David mentioned, birds of prey are always on the menu to look for. So if we've got top left, we've got honey buzzard, top right, hobby, bottom right, rough-legged buzzard, and bottom left, pallid harrier. But, you know, there's a huge diversity, not just of birds of prey, but many, many other species of birds to be on the lookout for in this part of the world. And going back to the reed bed areas or wetland areas, as David mentioned, this spectacular wagtail, the citrine wagtail, breeds in reasonable numbers. They're nowhere very common, but they breed in reasonable numbers in Latvia, and we've certainly got a very good chance of catching up with them. So what do the habitats look like? Well, this is the sort of area around Lake Luban, or Kenes National Park, I'm sorry, not Lake Lubans, we'll get to that in a minute. And just to show you a little bit of some of the habitat around there. And as David mentioned, it's also possible to see winter swans, hooper swans and Buick swans, particularly hooper swans in Latvia, in my experience. And this is just a pair that were in one of the fields. Some of them do breed in Latvia, but most of them do migrate further north for the breeding season. So there's usually one or two stragglers hanging around in May at the beginning of the summer. And we'll walk through some of the pine forests here and go along into some of the wetlands along these boardwalks, which are really very well supplied throughout the area. So you're very unlikely to come a cropper walking across boggy ground. There are plenty of boardwalks everywhere, which makes life quite easy for walking. Now, as David mentioned, woodpeckers are a big target for many people, but also this applies to Latvia. And Latvia, we will spend a lot of time looking for woodpeckers. Our guides will often use tapes to call them towards us. Obviously, in moderation, you know, there is a way to do that safely. But the sort of birds we will be looking for include things like the three-toed woodpecker shown here on the left, the white-backed woodpecker, which is very, very similar to a great spotted woodpecker, but you hopefully will make out the big patch of white on the back that these birds have and not great spotteds. Middle spotted woodpecker, it's one of my favorite of the European woodpeckers, this bird. And also probably the most dramatic of all, as David's pointed out, the black woodpecker. And this is a really big bird. It's as big as a jackdaw, really powerful beak, very often very noisy, like all the other woodpeckers in the springtime. And that's how we can often pick them out by their distinctive calls. And of course, another species of woodpecker not to forget is wryneck. And there are plenty of wrynecks to be found on the trip while we're in Latvia. But other small birds, greenish warbler, as David's pointed out, red-breasted flycatcher, hawfinch, and the long-tailed tit. This is the northern version of the long-tailed tit, much, much more attractive, in my humble opinion, than the one we have to put up with in Britain. And they really are like little snowballs with long tails, the northern long-tailed tit. It's almost worthwhile going on a trip to the Baltics just to see one of these. They are so stunning as little balls of fluff. And owls, again, they're a bit like woodpeckers. We try and see as many owls as we possibly can. This is pygmy owl. Again, it's a bird. It's one of the owls that comes out reasonably early in the evening, so you don't have to wait up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to see one. Whereas something like a Ural owl, it is a little bit later, or even something like a Tengmalm's owl doesn't usually start calling until the wee small hours. So, you know, there are plenty of opportunities for the owl enthusiasts to be satisfied. But the woodland, as David's pointed out, is absolutely spectacular through most of the Baltics, and I'm talking obviously about Latvia. And black grouse is again another bird that you perhaps wouldn't be expecting to see, but they are also reasonably common in amongst the pine forests, particularly where these bogs occur. They are very common there, and also the capercaillie, much harder to find. And you can get some interesting encounters, as David's already mentioned on his talk. So this is a view over the reserve at Kirkenes, and that's the sort of area of wetland that you can be exploring along these tracks and roads. There's a wonderful variety of waders and marsh birds, as well as birds of prey. Birds like white-tailed eagles, again, flying over periodically, putting all the birds up. So there's plenty to see. Lots of reed beds everywhere for the reed beds to be nesting in. So now we move further east to our second accommodation and our second part of the holiday. And this is in the area of Lake Lubans. This is our accommodation. And just to point out, the internet out there works extremely well. They're very sort of high tech. I'll give you an example. The last time I was in that building, I'm a Liverpool supporter, and Liverpool playing Tottenham Hotspur in the Champions League final. Everybody had gone to bed, and I had perfect internet to watch the cup final from that hotel. So just to give you an idea of the infrastructure. So what can we see at Lake Lubans that we haven't already encountered? Well, there's often a good passage of marsh terns. So in this picture, we've got several white-winged black terns and a couple of black terns. And these will be passing through at our time of the visit. And they can be found in the area around where we'll be staying at Lake Lubans. And other smaller birds in the marshy areas, things like the little crake, a very unassuming but very attractive bird. This is a male wandering sort of very, very quietly through the reeds. They're not very obvious at all. So you really do need to keep your eyes peeled to get a glimpse of one of these. And there's a good population of wading birds, either breeding birds or passing birds, birds passing through the country. So if we got here is a wood sandpiper standing appropriately enough on a piece of wood. And then we've got ruffs. There's a population of ruffs, which are often to be found at the right time, lecking. This is what they do in the breeding season. The males trying to outdo each other. It's a bit like the old-fashioned discotheques, I always imagine. The two different males here, a male with white ruff and a male with a more traditional brown ruff. And they're just trying to out-compete each other for the attention of a female. And then birds like marsh sandpiper, we can usually come across several of these birds in some of the wetter areas, and they're a beautiful bird at this time of the year in their spring plumage, with that needle-shaped beak, very, very much more of a diminutive green shank, really. And again, birds like redneck grebe breeding in breeding plumage. This one is on one of the lakes, Lake Lubans. There's several areas of wetland here. And a reasonably common bird to see. Nice to see them in breeding plumage. The ones we tend to see in the UK are mainly in winter plumage. They don't breed, they're not a breeding bird in Britain. And then more colorful birds still with blue throats singing from the vegetation around the area. Very distinctive calls these birds have, and they're very beautiful to look at when you get them in light like this. And more familiar birds, perhaps redstarts. There are plenty of redstarts to be found in Latvia on our trip over that course of that week. And even familiar birds like redwing, which don't breed in Latvia. They fly further north for the spring, but there's usually a population knocking around by the end of May, middle of May, that we can still find and add to our trip list. And even more bizarrely, birds like barred warbler can be found in the spring in Latvia. They're not a common bird anywhere, but they do look very, very dramatic when you get a view like that. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, the birds of prey are really dominated by the eagles, and this is particularly the particularly commonest one, the white-tailed eagle, with the white tail that these adult birds have. The juvenile birds get a progressively whiter tail as they mature. It's only the adults have a pure white tail, and these are still, thankfully, reasonably commonly encountered throughout the country of Latvia. So just like David, I would certainly advocate a trip to Latvia, and you know, the people are incredibly friendly, the infrastructure is excellent, the countryside is superb, and most importantly of all, the wildlife is fantastic. So I will stop there, and I will hand over rather to Sarah.